All right, you curiouser and curiouser Herle Burly-ites. Back in July, when we had our immensely popular The Chiefs panel on the pod for the 8th time, I very casually mentioned maybe we should give you your own show. Well, I'm chuffed to announce that while the Chiefs are far too busy and successful with their productive real careers to slum it every week in podcast land like I do, they have agreed to appear regularly, every quarter, here on the Herle Burly, to give us their governance wisdom. So a big huzzah to the Chiefs. 3 former chiefs of staff to some of Canada's most accomplished heads of government. Ian Brodie, first chief of staff to Stephen Harper, central to the founding of the CPC, now professor of political science at the University of Calgary, and senior advisor at New West Public Affairs. Brian Topp, former chief of staff to Rachel Notley in Alberta, deputy chief to Roy Romano in Saskatchewan, co-architect of Jack Layton's Orange Wave. Today he's a founding partner at GT & Co. And Tim Murphy, former chief of staff to Paul Martin, now executive vice president and chief strategic affairs officer at ACON. Today on the show, we'll assess what each party tried to achieve post the election to the start of Parliament, and were they successful. I want to talk a little bit about how Mark Carney is handling the major projects issue. There's an upcoming budget that I think everybody will have some interesting thoughts on. And I'm interested just in how Carney is defining the position as prime minister as he goes forward. So, plus we'll take a look at the opposition parties and what their real room to maneuver is in this minority parliament. So we got a lot to cover. We got to move briskly. But Tim, Brian, and Ian, thanks for being the newest, brightest, least jaded stars in the air quotes media constellation.
Somehow I doubt we're the least jaded, but otherwise, thank you.
That might be a contest.
Yeah. Speaking of jaded, one of your predecessors wasn't a chief of staff, actually. I think he was principal secretary, but there was no question who was in charge. A fellow named Jim Coutts was the most powerful person in Ottawa, not named Pierre Trudeau, from about 1975 to 1981.
And also under Pearson.
And also worked under Pearson. But as it now turns out, Jim Coutts, the feared Jim Coutts, kept a diary. Mm-hmm. And it's been published. It's a book. And I read sections of it last night, and by God, like you're really reading, you're saying it's July 2nd, and we had a campaign meeting, and Keith Davey was terrible. He didn't make any sense. He ran the meeting badly. The party's upset. And then it's Wednesday, and this minister is so terrible. And it's all there. It's all there. What do you think about that, Tim?
Well, I think it's, to be honest with you,
it is 50 years later, but nonetheless.
Yeah. I think it is something, those are all opinions we hold. Sometimes we write down and rarely we share.
Right. Right. Anybody got an idea why he would have done that and whether or not you think that's appropriate? Because I kind of don't.
You know, I in Britain, they have a tradition that we don't have here. People involved in politics, politicians and senior staff writing memoirs. And all hail the publishers of Coutts' book, because I read about it in Paul Wells' Substack, and I immediately bought it. I'm looking forward to picking it up and reading it. It's going to be a great read. I think it's a shame that there isn't more stuff like this in Canadian politics, that people involved in government don't write more. I think there's a quote somewhere that everybody in public affairs owes the public a book. Note to all of us here. And I think it's going to be fascinating to read. I think it's a curative to the kind of political coverage that exists now, which is all punditry about polls and who's up and who's down and what are they up to and all that kind of stuff. And instead it draws your eye back to the substance of government. And that he's catty and irascible about his colleagues just makes it entertaining.
Right. I would note that about every third entry references Goldfarb's numbers, though.
Yeah.
Well, I'm looking forward to reading the book because he ran in that by-election in Spadina. I was going to high school in the middle of that riding at the time of the by-election, so it's one of my early political campaign memories was seeing him run. I don't take as hard a lie as you do, David. I appreciate that he kept a diary. Of course, that's a good way of keeping track of what you're up to. And then they waited kind of 45 years to publish it. So I think some of the immediate injuries of politics must have passed. Surely by that point, people have gotten over whatever disputes he was in, and I think it'll be a good insight into that. So a later part of the Pierre Trudeau government, I'm looking forward to seeing what he has to say.
Yeah.
Although I think it's actually less and less likely that that'll happen, because I think people are going to be less and less keeping diaries, both because that habit of that in our virtual age is less, but also in the age of kind of, gotcha politics and committees that seek kind of personal diaries, personal entries, personal texts. If you're honestly pouring your heart out into your personal diary, the risk of that moving into the public domain is, I think, much higher now than it was. And I think that reduces the likelihood that people will do that.
Right.
I should say I just opened the royalty check for my book, David. I'd appreciate if everybody went out and juiced the sales a little bit, since the value of the check's dropping off.
If you want to get no money, write a legal book. I've written 2 of them, and basically I pay the publisher.
Right.
I wrote one, and I still owe this some money.
Well, thank God for Ken White. I don't think he charged Jim Coutts a dime.
Right.
So let's just sort of level set here before we get into the specific issues about where, as we sort of enter the fall session of Parliament, start to hit things like budgets, where everybody's at. I mean, it's been an interesting summer since we spoke. The government appears to have been busy, and I'm interested in your take. We've talked about it on the Curse of Politics a lot, about their issue management capacity, and I'm interested to hear your take on that as well. Poilievre had his by-election, got into the House. The NDP, Davey seems to be at least settling in as leader, etc. So maybe, Brian, set us off. Like, what kind of summer did the government have, in your view, and what did you notice about their position coming into this fall?
Well, Mr. Carney did superbly well in the election, because everybody thought that he was the guy to deal with Trump. And I think he showed a lot of what he brings to the table about that, in this, how superbly well connected he is with the network of allies that we have to have. Canada cannot prevail in an economic war and a threat to our sovereignty from the United States of America by itself. And so I think what we saw was the Prime Minister doing what he could to buttress our allies in various ways, including, for example, chairing a G7 meeting in Kananaskis, and many what look like smart trips to Europe, and that's to his credit. And so the people of Canada are hoping from him. And to the extent that was high profile, I think it goes a long way to explaining what's strong about why he's doing so well in public opinion. Also, however, we see the limits of this. We see the lack of leverage that Canada brings to these conversations. And so you see this government kind of maneuvering around a little bit, trying to manage the chaos of trying to talk to the Trump administration. And that has started to worry people, because what the government is basically saying is, we're not so sure that we've got the leverage to force the result here. And so we're going to have to try to do a deal. And deals always are fundamentally disappointing to all parties. So the government's abrupt dropping of the digital tax, for example, went over badly, and is hard to defend, other than just trying to manage tantrums in Washington. The drop of countervail tariffs is explicable, but also, I think, worried people. And so you start to see the bloom coming off the rose a little bit on the main thing that the Prime Minister brings to the table. Now, on whether or not he's going to be a good domestic Prime Minister, that remains to be seen. Being Prime Minister of Canada isn't an entry-level job. And it's a tricky work involving an enormous balancing act. Generally speaking, central bankers are not who people think of as the subtle practitioners of Canadian politics and on domestic front when you don't have a big externality like that to buttress you. And it remains to be seen how well they'll do.
Interesting. Um, I think I think that's what you see out there is everybody from the conservative wing to left-wing liberals saying, where are the elbows up? And, are we really going to join missile defense with them? And why do you talk about Trump that way? I gotta believe, Tim, that Carney is aware of everything that Brian just said in terms of how that is being perceived and still feels the need to do that. So he's in a very tricky situation because I don't think there's any question that people would have expected a tougher response. On the other hand, there's no more talk about the 51st state. There's no more real outbursts about Canada. CUSMA appears safe for now. So calling him transformational, is that a price worth paying?
I think he's figured out he's got to play the long game, right? I mean, I think, for a guy who walked into the top job without ever playing the sport in a way,
Right.
he used the issue to get elected to the job. And now I think he's smart enough to figure he's got to play, a 2-year window, a 5-year, whatever it makes sense from a longer term perspective, balancing that against obviously political objectives, and decided at the end of the day that, kind of he'll be judged on the outcome, not the process, which is actually on one level kind of refreshing. But I think, at the end, the outcome's got to actually be one that Canadians can understand and look at least, better than another option that might have been presented to them. So I think, and I think he comes to the table with a degree of, confidence Canadians have in his background and resume to be able to say, well, I might not agree with this or that, but I'm prepared to give him benefit of the doubt, right? And at some point that drops away when, for example, to Brian's point, when you negotiate CUSMA, and if people look at that deal and say, well, heck, we did all of this and that's what we got, then, the bloom could come off the rose quickly. So I think he's smart enough to manage to the longer process, pay a little rhetorical price here and there, I think is not costing him very much and may get him a better outcome. And I think that's the smart way to play it for now.
Did you ever think you'd be talking about, fretting about sovereignty, at least in a political context, when the calendar clicked to 2025? Me neither. However, anyone who follows these podcasts knows I think we're now living in an emerging new world order with new threats out there, and more optimistically, new opportunities. Continuing on the theme, our presenting sponsor Telus, together with OpenText, have just announced a strategic partnership aimed at delivering sovereign AI-powered solutions tailored for government and business. Or, said a little bit more proudly, given the context, this collaboration is going to integrate Canadian infrastructure, advanced AI innovation, and advisory services to provide a unique, sovereign solution for the Canadian market. It's a partnership that underlines with a giant felt marker, the irony of that old school analogy does not escape me, the importance of data sovereignty, ensuring our data remains within our borders, crucial for government and business sectors concerned with privacy and security. I'm the furthest thing from a tech expert, but they say it's the combination of Telus's robust infrastructure and OpenText's cloud capabilities that result in these kind of advanced, agile, and scalable solutions. Drilling down on some of the benefits, it means streamlined operational efficiencies and decision-making processes, improved service delivery, and a new standard in digital transformation for both government and business sectors. So huzzahs for Telus and OpenText for the step forward. And as always, friends, huzzahs for Canadian sovereignty. Ian, it feels to me like Brian started this off in a certain way, and it feels to me like part of this the public reaction to this depends on what Carney's mandate actually was. And I don't know if any of us really know the answer to this question. But was it as narrow as he's the best guy to fight Trump and stand up to Trump for Canada? Or was it more, a lot of things are going to change, we're in a lot of trouble, he's the best person to manage this situation to the best outcome for Canada economically? Because it leads to very different expectations of him.
Yeah, I guess I disagree with what our two friends have said so far here about the long game and about the focus on Trump. I think everybody in the last federal election campaign ran on the country is fundamentally in difficult shape. We had kind of 10 lost years or 10 wasted years of slowly deteriorating standard of living. The American economy powered ahead of us massively. Even the Europeans, who kind of had not a very impressive decade economically, they powered ahead of us economically. That Canada has really shrunk its economy on a per capita basis. The previous government had mismanaged the challenge of economic growth. So I think there was a demand for big change, big growth, better opportunities for our kids, better handle on immigration and so forth. Not just Trump, but it's time to get the country moving. And after 6 months, I think we look at how much in a similar period of time Mr. Trump has changed American economics, the American economy, American politics, the world order. And up against that, the Carney government, if their plan is to, play the long game over the course of the next 2 years, they're moving too slowly. They took 6 months to come up with a list of 5 or 6 national projects, a list that we probably could have had back in March. We're coming up on the end of November will be the first year anniversary of Mr. Trump's first big tariff threat against Canada. And in the course of those 12 months, we really haven't accomplished anything economically. In the meantime, I know we'll come back to the budget later. The government's financial and fiscal situation is deteriorating very rapidly. The economy continues to shrink. We continue to lose jobs. The tax revenue coming into the federal government and the provinces is not increasing. Expenditures are going up. The economic situation, strangely enough, is getting away from Mr. Carney. I think he must sense that. He's got enough economic experience to be able to see what's going on. You don't get the sense that there's any urgency in Ottawa about this. Parliament came back on Monday. What's changed since the day Mr. Carney became leader of the Liberal Party? I think you have to say, in the scheme of things, he, zeroed out the consumer part of the carbon tax. Great. What else is the future of the country? Does Mr. Carney have a plan? He's used to, I think, as a central banker, speaking on a quarterly basis and otherwise keeping his mouth shut. I think from the point of view of issues management, the government's done as well as any government ever does. No government does a good job of issues management, nor should they. But what we don't have is, where's his long-form interview with CBC or the Globe and Mail or somebody, anybody, Canada 2020, if you want, on a podcast, here with you, in which he lays out, here's where we are with the Trump administration. Here's where we are with economic growth. Here's why the country is going to look better in 2 years' time. We just have no idea. He's been off the field of play.
So I'm partly agree with that and partly disagree with that. So I agree a bit that I think he is actually playing a long game, but I think actually part of the politician's job is to explain the plan that supports that long game. And I think we haven't seen much of that from the government, outside kind of the notion that we need to get the economy moving, the articulation of a goal, but not a plan to get there. Where I think I disagree with you is the notion that he can sit down and say, here's our Trump plan. I think the challenge you have in that, as soon as you articulate that, you're waving a red flag in front of the bull, right? And I think they've figured out that rhetorically they need to play a different game. And that is, that's where I come back to my point, which is around Trump. You've got to play to the outcome and then take the prices on the way there to get the best outcome, which means, and part of that means you don't actually articulate your plan because he'll find a way to screw you up if you tell him what you're doing. Whereas I think on the rest of the economic challenge we face, I think the government has identified it as a problem, identified, the notion that we need to be open for business, but the how has not been articulated.
I also just like to add, I don't think most Canadians would want to benchmark the performance of their governments against the chaos of the American government. And also, it's easier to wreck things than to build them. It is easier to have a tantrum a day that is nonsense, that is just designed to flood the zone. I guess we can't use Steve Bannon's word, but you know what I mean. So, Mr. Trump is a disastrous president who is dismantling the United States step by step, beginning with their vaccine policy and working across the board. Just, completely inexplicable exercise of nihilism and madness. Yeah. And Mr. Carney is the central banker, as you say, guy who's used to talking once a quarter, Delphically and slowly, incrementally, working along on monetary policy, confronted with a first-class economic crisis and challenge to our sovereignty. So there's, I think, good news for Canadians and what they've been seeing from the government and what I was talking about earlier, which is that we can't deal with this alone. But I do think that what we also see is how an overwhelming externality can overwhelm the government of Canada, that they spend an enormous amount of time just maneuvering around in Washington, trying to find some kind of agreement with this cacophony of madness coming from south of the border. And at the end of the day, they risk not having that much to show for it. And also the experiment that they've been conducting, which is maybe we could get a fast deal if we just made some quick, and this was very popular among Bay Street CEOs who have a very good hearing in Ottawa these days. If we try to preempt what's coming from Trump with some preemptive concessions, then we'll get a quick deal and this will go away. And it's not going to go away. And so I think the government has, from what I can tell, accepted that there isn't going to be a quick deal that will make it go away. And in consequence, we are going to be in this for months, if not years. I think the Christmas reopener is going to be quite a show. And then with that as a very distracting externality, the question is, what else you got? And what else you got so far has been what? It's been an exercise in trying to identify some spending in the federal budget that can be reallocated to other priorities, which is not that exciting. And it has been a special projects group. Dawn Farrell's an impressive CEO, by the way. It's good that she's there. But the list of projects is not, going to fundamentally change Canada and our economy and reorient our exports to other markets. It's incrementalism, cautious incrementalism on a list of projects that we've already seen. And also, if I can add one more point, the prescription of the problem is a little bit off-center in my view. If I think about major projects, for example, TMX, that have happened in the last 5 or 10 years, the federal side of things was not the obstacle to them. So federal legislation was not the problem. Getting things greenlit in Ottawa was not the problem, notwithstanding the overheated rhetoric coming from the Premier of Alberta. That was not the problem. Problem with major infrastructure problems is the courts. And it's the legal impediments to getting anything greenlit, and nothing that's happened in Ottawa so far has cured that. So I think the Prime Minister runs the risk, because he is distracted by this externality, of not being that impressive on the domestic agenda. And at some point, the externality will be resolved, and it's going to be a messy deal that nobody's going to be happy with, which is not going to be that great. And then I wonder what else they're going to have to show.
So, whenever there's a meeting in the boardrooms or the rail yards or any of the offices of our sponsor, CN, no matter how high up the chain of command the participants might be, nothing can proceed, and I mean nothing, until there is a discussion of safety. When your business is running some of the heaviest machines ever made along steel tracks, through wilderness and through cities, night and day, in ferocious heat and deep winter, safety and caution has to be sunk into the bones of your operation, as it is at CN. And I don't just mean awareness. The railway spends hundreds of millions on safety technology as well. I say all this because this week is Rail Safety Week. That might not mean a lot to you, but it means a great deal to CN. All week long, the railway will be hosting events along its network of 20,000 route miles, hoping to educate and inform the public on how to stay rail safe. There are 14,000 public rail crossings in Canada. They deserve enormous respect. They are nowhere to play games. Remember, a train moves much faster than it appears, and given its inertia, it takes a long time to stop. Pretty much anything in a train's path loses. A train hitting a car is like a car hitting a toy. Stopped train cars can begin moving abruptly. For heaven's sake, stay away from them. Tunnels, bridges, and trestles and tracks are designed for trains and for trains only. For human beings, they are flashing red danger zones. CN railroaders undergo profound safety training. Their goal is to operate the safest railway in North America, and they are moving toward that relentlessly. But they cannot overcome or compete with recklessness or foolishness. Be aware. Give trains props. Stay healthy. Be safe. Let's shift gears here. Ian, take us through what you think the logic behind Poilievre's summer was. The overarching message seemed to be, we've considered the campaign and we'd run it again. And there's not a lot of need for change. So he's going to stay. He's got his by-election victory and thinks, and the polls say there's a lot of reason to believe this, that at least someday you'll be able to win an election in this country on affordability and crime instead of Donald Trump.
Yeah, man, I agree with that lineup. Look, as I think I said in the last podcast we did, Mr. Poilievre's election didn't really finish until he got himself back into the House of Commons. And so all of this initial assessment that, yes, the campaign was a success, the only problem is we lost, so let's run that campaign again in the future and we'll be fine. I mean, I think that's to be expected. His mind was focused elsewhere on getting himself back into the House of Commons and managing himself back onto the national agenda. Now is the time for further reflection on that. I think he has spent, since the by-election was over, time trying to test out the issue set. He came out very hard on the temporary foreign workers, the government's, frankly, complete catastrophe of temporary workers in the country. It suited his needs because there's certain skepticism in the country about immigration. It probably plays well with the Conservative base. It helps reorient the Conservative Party towards a blue-collar, manual workers, kind of low-income coalition. And in fairness, Mr. Carney is very hard on the other side of the issue. He's really misplaced himself on this, and most of his supporters are misplaced on this. But then the House of Commons came back on Monday, and I watched Question Period for the first time in a long time. No mention of immigration, as far as I could tell. No great attack on immigration. It looked like for a time being there that Michelle Rempel had, Canadian Tire and Tim Hortons and some big Canadian brands on the run for their job postings for temporary foreign workers at $35 or $40 an hour. My kids trying to look for part-time jobs, envious of those possible jobs, and sort of dropped it. I think there's also a wholesale changeover in the party staff, as everybody who was prepared for the election campaign has basically left, and they're now trying to rebuild. It's going to be a long, hard rebuild here. The only good thing is there's nobody competing with him for that spot in the political continuum. He's got uncontested access to the populist, conservative, blue-collar side of the spectrum. The NDP is in its own difficulties. The Bloc Québécois doesn't compete outside of Quebec, and the Liberals have got to sort out squaring Mr. Carney's, as Brian said, kind of Bay Street CEO agenda with a party base that reaches across a broader part of the spectrum. If I had one thing to worry about, it's not clear to me that Mr. Poilievre's team is focused on the riding by riding battle that's going on right now and is already underway for delegates for his leadership review in January. I think there is a certain approach that since there's nobody overtly campaigning against him, that he can waltz into that convention. Leadership reviews, as you guys know, are always surprising, always difficult. It's always trench warfare on a riding by riding basis. Mr. Chrétien may have thought that he could also waltz through leadership challenges in his own party and pay the price for it. And I worry that that's not at the moment under control.
Yeah. Interesting, Tim. I'm interested in your broad take about where Poilievre is at as we move into this session of the House, but I also want your take on something Ian raised, which is, for a number of years on the Curse of Politics, we talked about how there was a bipartisan, a multi-partisan consensus on immigration in Canada. And laterally, we've talked about how the Liberals kind of broke that. But we hadn't seen anybody campaigning on it or really raising it politically significantly. And just picking up where Ian's on it, it feels to me like Poilievre is careful, but touching the rail now.
Yeah.
There is when you talk about temporary foreign workers, that's a way of attacking the issue, speaking to it more broadly than you look like you're speaking to it. And the other thing, and I don't mean to be too cynical, is crime is also a surrogate for immigration and race in many, many circumstances. And they're talking a lot about crime.
Yeah. So if I were sitting in Poilievre's office, I would say, job one is, get your seat. Job two is retain the leadership. Job three, consolidate the gains we made in the last election. And those, I think, include, a bunch of seats where a significant new Canadian community resides, and the expansion into more blue-collar voters, who are actually NDP conservative switchers, and the Liberals aren't part of that. And I think, that move into the 40s in terms of support says, if we want to win, we need to consolidate the gains we made. So what's interesting is actually, to your point, if I look at those communities and how I speak to issues, I mean, some of that issue set includes crime, right? Especially like in that 401 set of seats, includes, competition for jobs, right? From like temporary foreign workers. So I could be, you could say it's also, a good fundraising issue for the base, but I think from a political strategic point of view, those are issues that help you consolidate the gains I think you made in the last election. And so I understand it. Now, I think, to your point, speaking about it as a third rail is the right way to think about it, because I think once it's a tinderbox, and once you light it, you may not be able to control where that goes. And we've seen how that plays, in the US, and I'm not sure we want that there. And I think we have a challenge as a country in terms of, the kind of, baseline growth out of the G7 average without immigration is a problem for us. Now, it got out of control, but, an expanding, our population through immigration is a sensible goal. What that number is, we can debate about it. But I think once you light that fire, you may burn down the house.
All right, Ryan, you can talk about whatever you want to talk about on this subject, but I'm going to prompt you. I'm going to prompt you with this. If you look at the polling that, say, David Coletto at Abacus does, you will find that more people think that Conservatives would do a good job of handling the cost of living crisis than the Liberals. You will find that more people think that the Conservatives would do a good job of handling immigration than the Liberals, crime than the Liberals, economy than the Liberals. Right? Why are the Liberals competitive with the Conservatives, maybe ahead of them in vote intention? Because Carney is vastly preferred as Prime Minister to Poilievre. And I'm going to put to you that Poilievre is not a good candidate. The Poilievre was only a really strong candidate when he was running against somebody as unpopular as Justin Trudeau. And that in the current circumstances, people don't really want to elect this guy, and they do need to change how he is perceived. Do you agree? And how might you go about that?
Well, I think two things. First of all, I don't think Mr. Poilievre is a sell in mainstream Canada. And the more you look at him, the less you like him. And he has followed his party into an embrace of the most extreme members of his party. And they have, just as this has occurred in Alberta with Conservatives, they've stopped playing to the center and basically take the view that what we need to do is embrace the most extreme members of our party. And although Mr. Poilievre is not a Trump, he's got an interesting, diverse background. He's not a racist, I don't believe. He does go and deliver coffee to convoy debaters and stand with some very inappropriate people as a dog whistle to hit to that part of the base. And I think that's partly defensive, that part of their party, let's put it this way, what he needs to do to survive the risk from the most extreme members of his party disqualifies him as Prime Minister of Canada. Another piece of the puzzle is that he's confronted with a much more difficult opponent from the perspective of the Conservatives. I would argue that basically what the Carney effect is in net terms so far, bearing in mind that he'll be held accountable for what he does, is to take the Liberal Party and move it 10 points to the right. And you can see this in a lot of the public domain polling that's been around since the spring.
Yep.
Basically, the Tories are down about 10 points, and the Libs are kind of holding at around 40, 45, and the Democrats have popped up 5 to 10. And that's because I think Mr. Carney has stopped Trudeau's game of trying to suffocate the Democrats, and now he's paying that compliment to the Tories. And that could be a lethal set of results if there was an election in that frame for the Tories, because I think they're at risk of doing less well than they did last time, even if they did rerun their campaign again. And it also creates some opportunities for Team Orange to get some of their clothes back.
Our sponsor, Fidelity Investments Canada, believes in giving back. So they're dedicating this ad space to one of their charitable partners, the world-leading and Canadian Hospital for Sick Children, better known as Sick Kids. Did you know Sick Kids has a podcast too? Sick Kids Versus is an award-winning pod that takes you behind the scenes of some remarkable stories and medical breakthroughs. One episode, called What Happens When a Life-Saving Device Gets in the Way of Living, tells the story of 4-year-old Harper, who was surgically tethered to a machine the size of a dishwasher for months while she waited for a heart transplant. Another follows a scientist who's challenging newborn mortality rates around the world. He's designed a kit that gives parents living in a remote part of Pakistan the tools they need to keep themselves and their newborn healthy and safe. And it only costs $5. You'll have to listen to the pod to find out how he did it. Sick Kids Versus is more than a podcast. It's a front row seat to the future of child health. Listen to Sick Kids Versus now, wherever you get your podcasts. Fidelity is proud to be there for sick kids. They salute these amazing children, their parents, the hospital staff, and whole community. Ian, do you have anything you want to say in closing on this section?
Yeah, look, back in 2015, when Mr. Harper lost the 2015 election and Mr. Trudeau won a brand spanking new majority, and he looked young and dynamic and so on and so forth, a whole slew of leadership candidates for the Conservative leadership after Mr. Harper resigned came through town to talk about, I don't want to run this time because Mr. Trudeau is going to have 2 back-to-back majorities and he's the brand new thing and there's no point in trying to blow our brains out for now. He's got a popular agenda, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Turns out that the rose came off that bloom, or the bloom came off that rose much more quickly than anybody anticipated. And if some of those people who came through town to explain to me how they were going to run, 8 years from now, 10 years from now, when the opportunity was back in our court, if they had run in 2015, it's possible that Mr. Trudeau would have been a one-term prime minister. I want to be very careful about taking snapshots at the moment. Brian's right, the NDP is up and may go further up once they have a leader in place or not, who knows. NDP candidates at the moment are off campaigning to the fringes of the NDP in an effort to try to scrape together enough votes to win the leadership. That's fine. Mr. Poilievre drove the Conservative Party to its biggest vote count since 1988. he is not an extreme character pandering to the extremes of Canadian population just by virtue of his election record so far. We'll also keep in mind that he helped drive Mr. Trudeau's numbers down to epic unpopularity. He's out trying to figure out how to do the same thing to Mr. Carney. He's got a little bit of time to do that. I think it's a bit early to write off Mr. Poilievre. I've known him since he was a kid. He is extremely ambitious and will turn himself into whatever is needed in order to take on whoever the Liberal leader is in the next election. I assume Mr. Carney.
All right. Okay. So let's move on to a substantive issue. Let's talk about the budget. Tim, I want to start with you because I'm interested in what the budget process is like when you have a prime minister that's likely to be intensely involved with very strong opinions about what's in the budget. So, I mean, they have, this is going to be a super interesting political exercise to watch. This whole austerity in operating costs versus spending on investments going to be extraordinarily difficult to explain to people.
Yeah.
Extraordinarily difficult to explain to people. It is likely to look like a counting sleight of hand more than something really inspired. The level of austerity is going to be, I think, very difficult to manage because we're nowhere near in the public mindset where the country was in 1995 in terms of preparation for cuts, nor is the political constellation quite the same because as dead as the NDP are, they're not as dead as they were in 1995 because of Ontario and British Columbia. So all of that to be said, this is an enormously important economic document, enormously important political document, and I'm interested in your take on how you think it's going to come together in this government.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because, you referenced the 1995 budget, but, there was a 94 budget
Yep.
in advance of that, in which kind of the government of the day, including the guy we worked for, had to kind of figure out how he was going to do. And he kind of had a practice budget. I mean, it was a real one, but you know what I mean. And then it took kind of between that budget and 95 to, figure out what the challenge was, prepare the public for, like it was, prepare the government for it, the public for it, etc. And I would say it feels like we're more like in the pre-94 budget, although we probably need a 95 style budget.
Right.
And maybe this government, has to do that same learning that was done, the 30 years ago, because they've had some of that bits and pieces, but it's been, they've not prepared the public for it. I agree with you. Like, you're going to have a headline deficit number of 75 billion. I don't know what the number is, but it's going to be big. They've previewed it's going to be big. And to then say, but that's not spending, that's investment, will go, yeah, sure, buddy. Right. So they've got that big challenge. I do think, though, that, if people have a sense that governments, the government employs a lot of people, not clear what they do, but they haven't prepared much of that ground. Like, if I'm investing, cutting, what does that mean? What's the plan? Where does that fit? So a lot of the kind of contextual stuff that I think the public, you want to prepare the public for, and to be able to basically, you want to set the exam so people understand the answers to the questions. They've done very little of that, in my view, both inside government and in the broader public. And, you've heard hints of it here and there, but that's not a political communication strategy. That's, more
Can I
like
stop you for a second?
Yeah.
In 1994-95, the finance minister convened the finance committee and presented to the finance committee, and it was on television. And it led the national newscasts and it led the papers. And everybody in Canada knew what the government was doing.
Yeah.
There's no such thing now. In fact, if I listen to all of you experts and, the way Brian talked about the Alberta election and various things, you'd have to be advertising. You would need to, if you wanted to have that level of public engagement with what you're doing, you would now need to be advertising.
Does the government advertise anything right now?
Not right now. They don't know.
I haven't seen one, I don't think.
No.
I've actually seen more U.S. ads about traveling to US for Canadians than I've seen anything from our own government. But so point taken, right? So I think, I mean, we're not a political communication show, but we've all been in that. And I think the political communication around the plan for the government is sorely lacking / non-existent. I also think that if I'm sitting there, as inside the Carney government, I think he hasn't built his team yet, right? He's kind of, it's more like kind of a takeover. I mean, a very friendly takeover, but it's a takeover, and he's kind of, now I get to go actually inside the company. He's going, well, that didn't work, and so I don't think we're at the point where he has confidence that he's got the, vice presidents to be able to deliver on the agenda he has, and he hasn't, so I think we're going to see a budget that they're going to have to learn from, right? But I think it's going to be a disappointment, and I think they're going to be disappointed. It's a disappointment.
One of the, I think, challenges they have, let's put it this way, from a government point of view, is that in a way they have to pick a swim lane, and it looks like they're trying to avoid that choice. So look, in the first term of the Romano government in Saskatchewan, dealing with the fiscal crisis was essentially all we did. Okay, it was an all-consuming challenge. Involved a big restructuring of revenues and expenditures. It was very, very difficult, and it involved a lot of communication with the public to explain to them why we were doing what we had to do, which is not unlike what you guys had to do in Team Martin in '95. And we can debate whether the right decisions were made and stuff like that. But my point was, it was when you decide that the government has a fundamental fiscal problem that has to be dealt with, that's basically what you're going to do with that term. But that's one swim lane, okay? And you could say, you could imagine a scenario where, after 10 years of the Trudeau government, blah, 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 somebody has to come in and quote unquote clean up the mess, and then that's what they're going to do. But meanwhile, there's another challenge, which the Prime Minister has articulated very well, which is you need to rebuild the national economy to be less dependent on the United States, and to move up the value chain, and to find new partners for your resource exports, and to find new things to do, and to reemploy many, many workers who are going to be dislocated in the state-driven restructuring of the North American economy that will not be dropped by the Trump administration, that has 3 more years to play. And that requires an enormous, almost World War II style throw by the government of Canada that is not about the Roy Romano 93, Paul Martin 95, return to fiscal probity, which, by the way, just set up 2 balance sheets to finance huge drunken parties by your Tory successors in both cases. So I think the problem here is that they're at risk of doing 2 mice, of saying that they're tackling the fiscal challenge facing the government of Canada and not fundamentally doing it, which is a huge
But do they have a choice to pick a lane, Brian, or do you actually have to? I mean, in the circumstance you outlined, don't they have to do both?
I think they have. No, I don't. Frankly, I don't think a rerun of the Martin process is what the times call for. I think the Prime Minister in his public statements has been putting his finger on what we need to do. We need to deal with a post-NAFTA world, and that involves some big throws. And the speech, I think the speech that Canadians need to hear pretty soon from the Prime Minister, and then a parliamentary committee, and then sustained communications program is, this is what we're going to have to do. Let's give you just one example. This Prime Minister's committed us to increasing the defense budget from 1.5% to 5%.
Yeah.
Really? How are you going to do that? That's 150 billion a year or so for the defense budget. Now, I think there's a pretty good argument for at least getting to 2. You could make an argument for maybe getting to 3. But if you're serious about that, then you're going to have to tell us how you're going to do it sometime pretty soon. Yeah. And reducing the paperclip budgets in the buildings behind me here is not going to finance that. So I think the government's got a lot of explaining to do. But my point is they're kind of at risk of not being very impressive on the 2 swim lanes that they seem to be trying to pursue simultaneously.
Nature has always been part of Canada's story. And for nearly 2 decades, it's been part of a successful federal partnership too. The Natural Heritage Conservation Program has helped protect critical forests, grasslands, wetlands, and shorelines across the country. It's conserved 2,200 natural areas that combined represent 1.5 times the size of Prince Edward Island. Put another way, that's about 900 hockey rinks worth of nature every day since 2007. Program partners like the Nature Conservancy of Canada have rallied landowners, companies, foundations, other levels of government, and people like you to match every federal dollar with another too. This has resulted in more than $1.5 billion invested in nature, securing lasting benefits for species, people, and communities. Benefits like clean air and water, flood protection, food security, job creation, and economic livelihoods, all while protecting places to hike, swim, paddle, and fish for today and future generations. As Canada looks ahead, it's worth remembering what's working for us now. Learn more by visiting natureconservancy.ca/NHCP. All right, Ian, it's time for you to jump in. I just want to say, as you do, that Brian pointed out sort of the real difficulty in this situation, in that they actually have to do a lot of things all at once, and it really feels like it's him that's doing most of it.
All of this, I mean, I don't live in Ottawa. I haven't been in Ottawa in a while. All the stories one hears out of Ottawa is this is all being run by 4 or 5 people who are very close to Mr. Carney, and none of whom, as Tim pointed out, are really his team, and therefore, in the scheme of things, it's all him. This goes back to the urgency issue. The economy is slowly deteriorating and collapsing around us. Jobs are disappearing. The trade issues with the United States haven't helped, but the problems go back further than that. It's been almost a year since Mr. Trump announced, before he was sworn in, that he intended to have a very serious tariff war with Canada. We knew, I think at that point, at the end of November of last year, what that was going to look like and what the implications were. Arguably, Mr. Carney took the summer to think about what he wanted to do and to put together his team. There hasn't been the big overhaul of the civil service. He's still tinkering around with his cabinet. He had his 3rd or 4th cabinet shuffle yesterday. If you look at the amount of time he's spending, as I keep saying, I think we all know, the commodity that's in the shortest supply in Ottawa isn't money, it's the Prime Minister's time. Mr. Carney spends a lot of time in Europe. He likes to go and meet European leaders. If I recall correctly, he just got back last week or the week before from his 3rd official visit to Europe since he became Prime Minister in January. I think I've got the numbers right. He likes to spend a lot of time in Europe talking to people, which is fine. Brian's right here. We need some allies in this fight. What has he brought back from the 3 trips to Europe, except some long-term plan to maybe build an LNG terminal in Hudson's Bay? I mean, I don't know who's going to build that. Take a look at the statements coming out of Enbridge. The Enbridge statements, Enbridge is a great Canadian company, a great Canadian pipeline company. There's demand for additional pipeline capacity. The Alberta government wants to double oil and gas production, and that means finding new export potential for it. We're probably not going to be able to export that to the United States in the way that we have in the past. There's an economic case there to go ahead. There's demand across the Pacific and demand across the Atlantic for that. Enbridge, in its previous life as Interprovincial Pipeline, its first pipeline, in the course of its first 12 months, got legislation through the House of Commons just before the 1954 election, got a permit 4 weeks later from the regulator, and 12 months after the process started, half the pipeline had been built from just outside of Edmonton to Wisconsin. It is possible to do these things on an urgent basis.
By the way, you can't take an historical analogy and drop it halfway through. And what happened after that? The populist Conservative from Western Canada defeated the statist establishment economic managerial liberals.
Let me finish the story. Yes. Mr. Diefenbaker correctly understood that these kinds of big infrastructure projects have to be put outside the political process and established a National Energy Board. And what have we done, in order to get that out of the political process and to establish a regulatory process that would give some assurance to investors that we were serious about getting this stuff built? Mr. Carney, since he became prime minister, has done nothing but repoliticize what was already a very highly political process. He's taken us away from the formula that we know succeeds here, getting our resources to market, growing jobs and growing the economy and connecting us to new types of markets overseas. Like, I don't understand what's going on here.
If I can say so respectfully, sir.
Yeah.
The government that said that the cabinet can overrule the National Energy Board and the other regulators was the Harper government.
Right.
And that was, if I may say so, disastrous for Western energy industry, because what it did was it made decisions by regulatory bodies justiciable. And I referred earlier to the fact that it's not federal legislation that's the problem. It's the fact that you can tangle up projects in the courts, and that is directly as a result of the decision by the Harper government to politicize regulation in Ottawa, with the ill-fated and, if I respectfully say, foolish view that they were going to force the regulators to come to decisions that they wanted. And what they got instead was years and years of litigation.
Look, I'm not going to go back and really, fair point. We know the formula for success here, Brian, and we've spent the last, Mr. Carney became prime minister in March. So far, we've moved in precisely the opposite direction. And Enbridge and everybody else who wants to invest in this business has been telling the government, you're moving in the wrong direction here. This isn't the right approach. It's going to get us the nearest term access to economic growth, jobs, and security for the future in different types of export markets. And the government seems to have absolutely no urgency in fixing that solution, coming to that solution.
Well, if I can just put one more here. So what we did learn, you're absolutely right about that, is that these big, nation-changing infrastructure projects are very, very hard to do with the private investors and private investment capital. And so you need a public builder to make them happen. And this is back to my point that does not align with a quote unquote austerity budget, and with focusing on debating the paper clips in the desks of the public. And this is back to what are you trying to do here? Are you just trying to fiddle around with the budget, or are you trying to take a big throw? And the big throw is fundamentally going to have to be driven by the public.
The problem with time
Tim,
here,
wait
Brian,
a second. If we can shift from Tim on this, Ian, because Tim, you're actually in the major projects business now.
I am. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, look, there are. One of the complaints about the Trudeau government was it was creating an investment climate in the broadest sense, where people who were deciding where to put their money in oil and gas development and pipeline, whatever you wanted to invest in, where they did not view Canada as a friendly environment. True or not, that investment climate was a political problem. You then had underneath that the regulatory process over which the government had some authority. To be honest with you, that takes a long time, and that's been true under successive governments. You could make that shorter, more efficient, and this government has tried to do something about it through this Major Projects Office and the Bill C-5. I think what Brian is identifying and is a real challenge is, if you're going to build these large things, you're generally doing it through communities that have constitutional rights that the courts have upheld. And so, to make the deals that are going to make those possible, the government's going to have to lead, because, frankly, what it's done historically, and all governments have done this of every stripe, is outsource that problem to the private sector. And that's been a massive delay in the ability to get it. So I'm sitting there, if I'm a private investor, saying, well, the investment climate's iffy. I've got a long regulatory process that's as long as everyone else, but still painful, and every year is money. But then I've got this uncertainty of the, judicial rights that the Indigenous and other communities have, and the government's not helping me. So I'm taking my ball and I'm going somewhere else. So if I'm sitting there solving that problem, it is a political solution, because you're saying, I'm going to have to help solve the problem as a government. Part of that's money, part of that's process, part of that's one window, authorities, part of it's speaking to the investment climate. So I looked at what the government's done around the Major Projects Office, And I would say they're trying to tell the community we're open for business, right? So you want to come and do some things, we're here to talk. We're providing you a place to go in the major projects office. I would say the first 5 things they put in the window, they kind of had nothing to do with. Right? They were already well progressed and or basically already building, right? And so, but I think the point of those 5 things was to illustrate to the market, hey, these are the kinds of things we want to do. You come to us with these kind of things, we'll find a way to help. So I think there was a bit of a political showmanship to that, but largely a kind of investment message. The real test is the other 10 things they listed. And frankly, to Brian's point, if any of those are going to get done, you're going to need 2 things. You're going to need the leadership of the federal government and money. And one of the things that I think Carney is doing very well is working with the provincial leaders and the provinces to create the opening for those things to proceed, to create channels of communication, openness, bargains, because, he's going to need them. And so, now the story of this hasn't been put together, connecting it to jobs and opportunity and how my life gets better as an individual voter. But I understand what the government's trying to do, and I think it's the right direction. There's still work to be done, and there's political communications over top of it. But I think it's the right direction.
The trap is to not do, pharaonically expensive, you can never come back from these mistakes, socializing of risk and privatizing of benefits. And, that is often basically the pitch that you get from the private sector partners, whose capital you need to get these done. And so it's going to take some smarts. To their credit, Mr. Sabia, who has moved into a very senior role in this government, who used to work for the Caisse de dépôt et de placement in Quebec, knows this game. So I have some hope that, and this is the solid part of Mr. Carney and his team, that they know how to find a deal with public capital. It doesn't end up just being a shocking and disastrous ripoff of the taxpayer, but that instead is truly playing the role of being, a strategic throw by the government of Canada to make things happen that must happen, but that cannot happen just with the private sector part.
To connect this back to the budget, David, this is all, I think Tim and Brian have been making my point for me. There's a lack of urgency here on the part of the federal government to get some of this stuff moving. Part of my worry about urgency is you look at the financial markets, the appetite for more government debt, whether you call it spending or whether you call it investment or whether you call it some other fancy word, is very antsy right now. And every major economy on the planet seems to be doing everything it can to borrow as much money as possible.
Surely if there's
drive itself into a fiscal problem.
Surely if there's any policy area where you're prepared to defer to Mark Carney, it might be on what the markets are how the markets are going to react to a fiscal number.
I wouldn't defer to him on that. He was the central banker. He just printed money when he needed it.
Oh my God. Oh my God. Social credit has arisen.
All right. We're running out of time, and I do want to, because I think we've had enough time to do this, make an assessment. Every prime minister does the job differently. And that's, I think, certainly true of Carney. People in Ottawa tell me that this government could not be more different in the way it operates internally than the Trudeau government was. And there's been a number of cultural differences to it. Tim, do you have any initial thoughts as to how Carney is defining the role of prime minister?
I think from his defining the role can be, I'm creating a public perception of the role and how I actually behave, and they may or may not be the same things, right?
Right.
I think Prime Minister Chrétien was very good at creating one public perception of him, and his private running of that office was different, and he was pretty good at both. I think it's not clear to me yet where Prime Minister Carney fits on managing both and how explicit he is about both. What is clear, though, is he has a way of running things, and he is imposing that on government. And that is somewhere between a CEO PM and a kind of technocratic manager of the government, but where, a lot of the roads lead to him, but he's accessible for it, right? As you know, like a a lot of people have his cell phone for texts, and they both send him notes that get to him, and he is sending notes at all hours of the day back saying, well, how is this? He also is trying to create, I think, I think, again, this is like a CEO, more technocratic view of it, a level of accountability, like, you were supposed to do this, have you done that? Whether that is as successful a role politically in the long term is the open question for me. And part of that is, I think there was an appetite for that kind of prime minister, frankly, and part of the reason he's getting the benefit of the doubt and was voted for, because he was bringing that kind of competence to the role. But I think some of the weaknesses that role, that way of behaving, we've been talking about, which is, you tend as a CEO to think, what I say it once and the market will read it, and sophisticated people will understand it and pay attention. And as we all know, that's not the way politics works.
One little thing, Brian, and I'm just interested in what these kinds of signals are. Apparently, in the latter stages of the Trudeau government, it wasn't uncommon for staffers to show up to work in sandals and cargo shorts and shit like that. And Carney's put in a rule where everybody that works in the minister's office is in a jacket and tie and black shoes. Right? Important, not important.
Yeah. I have to say, when I saw the PMO staff, which was at this NAFTA council that I was on for 2 rounds of, they showed up in pretty natty suits. So certainly the Prime Minister Trudeau saw to it that, at least when somebody else was looking at them, that they looked pretty good. But let me just offer you this thought about Carney. All political careers end in tears, as they say. Everything always has a beginning, a middle.
Certainly mine.
He has a certain amount of time. Okay? He has a cycle. We'll see how long it is, but it is not going to be forever. And the beginning is when you have the most flexibility, in my experience, and it's when you set your course. And lots of people can row, but fundamentally only one person can steer, and that's the top person. And he is beginning, I think, to dance around the risk of getting distracted by files, of being distracted by the insanity south of the border, and failing to set a clear course. And he needs to soon, he needs to, let's just remember, this is a minority parliament. Like, his agenda may be tested in an election sooner rather than later. I certainly don't think he's got 4 years. And so I think he's at risk of being a really good public servant as opposed to being a political leader. A political leader pays attention to steering. This is one thing that Mr. Chrétien was very good at, was just in simple, clear words, telling the universe that listened to him, which was pretty good, this is where we're going. And people went, okay. I'm not sure people really have a sense of this is where we're going in Canada, other than that this guy looks like he can deal with Trump, which is a thin reed to build the whole government agenda on because of how mercurial President Trump is.
Right. Ian, do you have any observations about Carney's style as Prime Minister, his approach to the job?
When I think back about the last, post-war era of government in Canada, I think Mr. Carney's off to a similar start to Mr. Morney, where Mr. Morney had come from. He'd spent his life in politics, obviously, but largely outside the political world. Mr. Morney was very confident in his own ability to make all of the decisions, so all of the files ended up on his desk. He came to office in 1984 without really much of a political team, despite the fact that he'd been, dabbling around politics for quite so long. He didn't quite have much in the way of a staff of organization. There were no cell phones at the time, so nobody could text him at all hours of the day, but it's pretty clear that Mr. Morney was on the phone all hours of the night and day, trying to manage every file on his desk. And every file in the government went through his hands. And ultimately, that overwhelmed him and left the government unable to get anything done. So there was, credit to Mr. Morney. He's the only prime minister who's really, in a very serious way, changed the course of his government partway through his time in office. reorganized PMO, reorganized the cabinet, delegated massive amounts of authority, not responsibility for the government's overall performance, but massive amounts of authority to his ministers, to Don Mazikowski and to others, put together a modern government organization where he could focus on two or three things and leave everything to somebody else. Mr. Carney hasn't come to that point yet. The difference between the two of them is that Mr. Carney was happy in the public eye. He was a persuasive speaker. He had come from very humble origins like Mr. Carney, but hadn't been laundered through Harvard and Oxford and central banks like Mr. Carney. So Mr. Mulroney was ultimately quite comfortable in the public eye. It's not clear to me that Mr. Carney is. I think what kind of prime minister Mr. Carney is, we don't know yet. It's hard to tell. He's hardly been in the public eye. As I said, so far what we've learned is he likes to spend time in Europe talking to European leaders, which I think is fine. I mean, I agree with Brian on this. That's reconnecting with allies is probably not a bad idea. What he brings to those tables isn't clear. Other than natural gas, it's not clear what else Canada has that other countries want. What has he told the rest of us about what he's up to? I think that's a story that's yet to be written. And all the stories about the internal operations of this government are trouble. I think Mr. Carney will have to find his Derek Burney to come in and recalibrate the government, to make some decisions, to get some things moving, to get 8,000 files off of Mr. Carney's desk and onto somebody else's desk so he can focus on the two or three that really matter.
Okay. There's just one follow-up I want to do on this before we have to wrap, and that is, in addition to European leaders, we learned the other day in question period that he's talking to Trump all the time. So in some circumstances, in the discussions with the Americans, he sends ministers. So Dominic LeBlanc, other lead ministers on the file, are down in the States, down in Washington, talking with Lutnick and the various people. Other times, he sends his chief of staff, Marc-Andre Blanchard. Once I read that he sent Michael Sabia, the clerk of the Privy Council, down to Washington. What are the different circumstances in which you send different people? In what circumstance would you send the chief of staff instead of the ministers?
You know, I think this is various experiments in trying to talk to a cacophonous American administration. But the bottom line is that nobody has any agency in that government except the president.
Right.
And the president is, as I said, an awfully mercurial fellow. And I also think that it's taken a while for us to accept, in a layer cake of engagement with the United States, but for example, let's not forget, we have a really good ambassador in Washington. She talks to them every day. And then we have ministers and senior staffers talking to their equivalents who do not have agency. And we have the prime minister talking to the president. But there's some immovable realities here, which is beneath all the noise and the political noise and stuff like that. The Republican Party, its president and its congressional team, are pursuing an interest, which is they want to flip Pennsylvania and Michigan and to lastingly move those states into the Republican column. And the way that they're doing that is promising to reshore the steel industry into Pennsylvania and the auto industry into Michigan, which are direct line of sight shots into the heart of the Eastern Canadian economy. And I don't think they're going to be dissuaded from this because of a charm offensive from Canada urging them not to do it. And so that's the nut of the reality. And then what is going to follow along behind it is every trade grievance and problem and demand by every industrial group in the United States that bought tickets to the inaugural is going to be stapled together as the United States' demands for the NAFTA reopener. And so we're into months and months and months of very, very difficult trade negotiations with a president that allows himself to say, I'm not even sure we need this agreement. So that is the reality that our senior people in Ottawa are saving. God help them. You can understand how it would be incredibly distracting. And somewhere along the line, I think they need to accept that when they talk about the need to re-gear us to a relationship to the world that's different than it is right now, they're right. What they've been saying is true. And I don't see the plan yet to do it.
Ian,
I think,
with the chief of staff. Sorry, Tim, were you
yeah,
starting?
yeah, I
You
was
go
just
ahead.
going to say, I think, part of what you do when you have people talking to other governments is try to match, function to function. And, and I would agree with Brian, like trying to understand uh, what the U.S. government wants is and how it plans to get there and what you can negotiate and what's possible and not is challenging, right? Because you do have a mercurial head of government who, says one thing one day and one the other and can go to, we don't need you to, while at the same time preserving CUSMA. So it's now I do agree there's a political agenda underneath it. So at some point you're going to see, one of the people who has been generally seen as a reliable, relatively calm person in the Trump administration is his chief of staff, right? And so you would want to send down your chief of staff to talk to her and to say kind of, what does this mean? Where can we go? And then you have the, Treasury Secretary talk to the equivalent. You've identified Dominic as kind of the main face of the government outside of, so he can kind of go all over the place. And so I think it is, a mixture of trying to understand what the objectives are, whether there's room for negotiation, can deals be done, what's really happening, and you keep those conversations going. And because I think if you can get a deal that's acceptable, you're going to use every lever you have, and yeah, that's going to be distracting.
Ian, is the Prime Minister's chief of staff viewed as a more senior person in, say, Washington than a minister is?
I would say the chief of staff has some room to maneuver, and insofar as the chief of staff has a pipeline to the top, that is a helpful position to be in. On the two occasions when I went down to Washington on my own as the senior person, we were dealing with the Bush administration in its final days. The Bush administration in its final days was sort of a very finely tuned machine. Part of what helped at that point, and part of what I think helped until Mr. Trump came back, we had thousands of points of contact with the U.S. government. And this is a game that every party plays back many, many years. You start dealing with people when they're appointed deputy assistant secretary of whatever for some job nobody's ever heard of. And then in the next administration, they move up to be assistant secretary and then deputy secretary and then secretary. And they move back and forth between, law firms and think tanks and Capitol Hill and so forth. And by the time they become somebody who can really pull a lever, they're already known as a friend of Canada and they have hundreds of points of contact with Canadian government officials. That era of Canada-U.S. relations, which served us very well from 1939 until last year, is now over. The kind of the I hate to use the term the deep state, the permanent government of both the Republican and the Democratic Party has been shattered. All of those jobs have been eliminated. None of those people have any decision-making authority, and it's not clear the U.S. is going to regenerate that type of political class ever again. Certainly not on the Republican side. I don't see that. I don't see that ever coming back. I guess the difficulty here is you can send lots of people to Washington, but nothing has been accomplished here. We've made rounds of concessions in the ongoing negotiations with the United States, and it doesn't seem to have accomplished anything.
You don't consider, just to interject, because I presume this would be the government's response. You don't consider the fact that CUSMA is still in place to be an accomplishment.
No. I mean, repealing CUSMA would have caused as much trouble for the United States as it would have for us. So no, I don't consider that to be an accomplishment. The photo to me over the summer was when Mr. Zelensky came to meet Mr. Trump in the White House. The G7 was there to help facilitate the deal, except that instead of Canada, it was Norway. And the Norwegian Prime Minister, who has some kind of background in golf and is on conversational terms with Mr. Trump and goes back and forth about, can discuss in detail Mr. Trump's golf courses and the golf game and UFC and all this stuff, has replaced us in that conversation. I don't want to overinterpret that. That's not the end of the world. Mr. Carney had his own pass through Europe to go to Ukraine in his most recent of his 3 trips to Europe so far. It's early days yet, but it's not clear that there's an overall game plan here. We're still trying to figure out how to play with the Trump team. And there are other countries that have moved faster, that were better prepared for this, that were better engaged with the Trump team during the election campaign and through the election campaign and since the election campaign. And we still seem to be trying to figure out how do we get his attention by some kind of, text message at midnight.
I don't think I agree with that.
Mr. Carney has not yet been on any of the Fox News programs to speak to people in the White House. I find that inexplicable. Like, he speaks English. He lives in the Eastern time zone. He could be on Fox News every Thursday, Friday, and Saturday from 10 o'clock until midnight when Mr. Trump's paying attention. Other people have figured out how to do this, and somehow we have not figured out how to do that.
Yes, and this is back to what we're saying about this prime minister, that he's a central banker and not a politician fundamentally. And politicians might say, what I need to do here is change the air game in Washington, and so I'm going to go use the channel. And as you're correctly pointing out, lots of other people are doing that these days. He's used to saying really important things every now and then, and saying them once, and the market moving as a result of every little comma that is what he said. And that's not the world he's in anymore.
Right. All right. Well, listen, the
Americans are back asking us to help in Haiti, and we still don't have any way of help. The Americans have been after us for 4 or 5 years to help in Haiti. Nothing. We don't have anything that can help on Haiti. If we don't have anything to help on Haiti, I don't know what we're gonna. What leverage do we have here? We've disabled ourselves from being a player in Washington.
All right. Listen, you guys. Thanks. I don't think that everybody agrees on that last point, Ian, but we're going to leave it there. We're going to leave it there. We're going to leave it there anyway. Thank you. Thank you both for today, and thank you for agreeing to make the time commitment to do this on a regular basis. People really get a lot from this. People really learn a lot from the three of you. So I really appreciate it. And I don't like to say this in front of Tim because we have a long friendship, but I learn a lot from you too. So anyway, I'd like to thank our sponsors who make this free podcast available to all of you Herle Burly-ites. Thanks for watching or listening. We'll be back next week, but thanks for watching this week. Appreciate it. Take care of yourselves.